Hi everyone! It's been a while since I've done a video, so I figured I would do something a little bit different, and in this video we're going to go over a topic related to mixing. And this concept here is what we're going to go over today. And it's the whole idea of cutting out the low frequencies when they're not needed. Not many people really go into the reasons why it's important, and sort of some good ways to think about how to cut out those low frequencies so you don't really lose the life of your mix. And we're going to go ahead and remove a lot of these high-pass filters, and we'll hear the difference. And I'll sort of start to explain more in detail why we do this. I figured I would do it on something that I'm actively working on rather than setting up this little nice and neat perfect little project, because this is more of a real world example of how things will come together. So first things first, we'll discuss some of the elements that we are using high pass filters on. So the very first thing we're doing it on is the organ, which has this sort of cut going on. And the other most important element that is introduced into the mix are the pads, which also have a high pass filter. So what we're going to do is actually play it back again. I'm going to disable these sounds and then play it again, and you'll hear the complete difference. Okay, so you kind of get the idea of what I'm going over now. You can hear there's quite a considerable difference between the first thing that I showed you, which is with EQ, and what is being showed now. So we need to understand some really important concepts, some fundamental ideas about how a mix works, and sort of why this is important. So the very first thing we need to keep in mind is that an electronic instrument doesn't work in the same way an acoustic instrument does, like a guitar or whatever, for example. And obviously, when I say that, it's duh, that makes sense, but you don't really think about why. So when you have a traditional instrument, it's constrained entirely to the materials it's made out of and the sort of environment it's in. And because of that, the harmonic content is pretty much locked entirely to the overall design of the instrument and the materials used. Electronic instruments don't have any of those limitations. So when you have a note, it's going to play the entirety of that frequency spectrum of that note. In nature, instruments that are acoustic generally have their own natural high pass or low pass filters and their own sense of harmonics based on what I discussed before. In electronic music, once again, each waveform has its own characteristics, but it's going to fill the entirety of the frequency spectrum for the most part, especially with certain types of waveforms. So when you're making electronic music, you kind of have to grapple with this concept, because not dealing with these sorts of issues kind of will cause you a lot of problems, as you just heard. You know, the mix sounds considerably worse, it doesn't sound natural at all, and not only that, it just sounds muddy and undefined. And all it took was 2 instruments to cause this problem. As we can see in the visual representation here, that there's considerably more low frequency content in the older version than there is in this one. And you can sort of think of this as the concept of having headroom in your mix. And what that is lower frequencies will take up more energy, or you could say more resources within any mix. It's a fundamental thing that applies to all genres. Basically, like an economy, you have a limited amount of resources that you have to manage. And with a mix, this is kind of the exact same thing. And it's predominantly why certain genres of music have their own styles of mixing, because they focus on different things. Same thing here, we're making house music, so our focus is on a very clean mix that translates well in a club environment, but that can also be played and understood on other sound systems as well. which is why we have to really pay attention, especially in this style of music, but any electronic music in my opinion. Okay, so the information I gave before is all well and good, but how do I know how steep of a high-pass filter to apply? How do I know when to apply it? And how do I know when it's too much? I'll give you some guidelines here in a second, but the simple answer to that is there's no real way to know until you get a better ear and you start to understand things more. You'll see a lot of tutorials out there that try to give you this fake bullshit advice that doesn't help you. The reality is it's just going to take time. Much like the resolution of what you're watching now, your hearing resolution will improve over time. Okay, so all that being said, here's some basic guidelines you can think about when you're doing any sort of high-pass filtering. Number one is too steep of a filter can sound very unnatural. In the natural world, when you're high-passing an instrument, the roll-off isn't nearly as steep as you would think it is. So you're still going to have some natural sounds from the instrument itself that are kind of just achromatic, and also various other low frequency sounds with whatever the instrument is playing. That being said, it's not usually a very sharp cutoff on the frequency spectrum. There tends to be a little bit of a roll-off. And what you can see here, this is actually quite a steep cutoff. Normally I would do something much more gentle, but because this has such a considerable amount of low frequencies, and because it's sitting in a very specific part of the mix where it's not too much in your face, in this particular instance it made a lot of sense that I would high pass it at a very steep angle. And the way you can do this is actually to start out with something that's really mellow and then sort of adjust the Q or resonance depending on what you're using over time, and then you can even increase basically the decibels per octave. And if we take a listen to the pads here, you can tell that I made a much different sort of frequency curve. So when you have something that sounds more string-like, especially like this is kind of when you're going to want to consider thinking about the harmonics that exist within the sound that you're using. And we can see everything kind of hits around this area where the bass is, and it sort of tapers off as it goes more into the higher frequencies, which is what we want with a good pad sound in my opinion. However, this can still clash with the bass frequencies that currently exist, which is going to be right in this register here. So what we need to do is sort of kind of find a happy medium between those two sounds. So where does the kick and the sub frequencies lie? And where do the rest of the instruments kind of exist within the mix? And what we're doing here is making a decision that, okay, we're going to want to emphasize this part of the frequency spectrum of this sound, and we're going to de-emphasize this part and this part. And the reason is because we have the organ kind of filling a similar space around here, and we have the other low frequencies here. So logically what we'd want to do is have a nice little smooth curve on the way down. So these frequencies for the most part are actually still within the mix, but we're basically attenuating the volume as we go down. That's basically what you can think this of as basically what an EQ is you're changing the volume of different frequencies, and we're making the decision in this case to change the volume of these. And I just cut off a little bit of the high end because I felt that it was clashing with the percussive elements in the song, and it was kind of stepping on the lead solo synth. I'm cutting it at 159 approximately. I know I moved it around a little bit in this example, but in this one I cut it around 200 Hz. That's sort of where things are coming off. So the low frequencies are being cut in a similar range to make room for the bass and the kick, but one has a much steeper curve than the other, and that's just due to the harmonic content of the instrument itself. So on the right here we have the kick drum, and on the left this is the bass. And as you can see, both of them are high pass actually. So when it comes to these frequencies in the very, very low subspectrum, it's going to be maybe worthwhile to consider using a steeper curve, because as you get lower within the frequency spectrum, things can be a little bit more difficult to control and maintain, unlike here in the high area. So it's a worthwhile decision to consider doing a steeper cut. And also, as you see here with my kick, some of you may be wondering why I decided to actually high pass filter my kick drum as well. So here's some things to note. Remember earlier how I talked about when we have a mix, there's a concept of headroom, or you can think of it like in terms of an economy, we only have so much space. So you have kind of two different options. You can have the bass be the predominant thing in the low frequency spectrum and the kick kind of back off, or the kick could be the fundamental part of the low frequency content and the bass itself sort of takes a little bit of a step back. And that depends entirely on the style of music that you're making. Okay, so I think that's enough information to fill your ears with at this point in time. I hope all this was helpful and that it made enough sense, at least to sink in somewhat. I know it can be kind of overwhelming, especially when it's a video like this, but I'd rather give you the fundamental understanding of what's happening rather than some like garbage ass clickbait video that doesn't really tell you anything, and you learn the motions but not the actual like reason for doing it. And to me that's more important than anything. So that being said, it's going to be something that, especially if you're newer to music production, it's going to take you a while to understand and to implement, and that's okay, and it naturally should. So you may be frustrated for a while as to why it's not sounding that great, and that's just because it's going to take time. And if you just allow yourself not to get frustrated, and you just focus on really listening to your mix and not over-obsessing about it, you'll start to really make breakthroughs into moving forward. And I think I'll be back to doing videos more regularly again. I just got really sidetracked with doing the sound design and music composition for the game Farm Folks, and that's just been filling up most of my time lately. But that's more me making excuses for not sitting down for an hour and making a video. Well, especially in this case, because I'm just using my webcam instead of my proper setup. And lastly, I'd like to thank everyone for all the subscriptions and stuff like that. It's really nice of you. I haven't uploaded a video in a month and I've gotten almost like 100 subscribers, which is pretty great actually. So it means my videos are connecting with you and that they are saying something of substance that's helpful, so that's good to hear. That being said, thanks everyone so much for taking the time to watch this video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video as well.